Okay, we're gonna stick with the time after time theme because we're replacing again. Okay, so we're at the Gravettians now. So we had our Aurignacians who had moved in, the hunter-gatherers who came in after the volcano. And remember, I pointed out that there were the populations that moved into that peninsular part of Europe, they were coming from this one ancestral population there. So we have the Aurignacians before, and now we have the Gravettian expansion. 32,000 years to 22,000 years ago. The Gravettians are amazing. So they also came into Europe from the northeast. They pushed out the Aurignacians, who seem to have been almost entirely, basically entirely replaced from what we know about the ancient DNA. The Gravettians were deliberate about burying their dead, so we actually have a lot of remains from them, of human skeletal remains from the Gravettians. We know that from their remains and from their skeletal remains and from their archaeological remains, we know that they were in Belgium, in Italy, France, Germany, the Czech Republic. We know from the DNA that they were all quite genetically quite similar to each other. So this cultural group had a pretty wide geographic range. We know they were hunter-gatherers, but they weren't just any kind of hunter-gatherers. They did intense mammoth hunting, and this sets them apart from the Aurignacians. Similar to the Aurignacians, though, they made Venus figurines. They also made musical instruments. They did cave art like the Aurignacians. They also had bone and ivory tools. They used woven nets, and they had oil lamps made of stone. Now, these people lived in a time that was very cold, and that cold period that preceded the deeper cold of that last ice age, what we call the last glacial maximum. And as that last ice age got into swing, Europe became basically covered in glaciers, and these people then needed to move out. But let's look at what they were like for about that 11,000 years when they occupied Europe. So the Gravettian Venus figurines, these are just spectacular figures. The one that you saw before for the Aurignacians was pretty interesting as well too, but we see many more of them occurring with the Gravettians. So here you have, here's another. It's a replica of the Venus from Les Begou, I think is how you pronounce that. There's the Venus of Willendorf. This one is really famous, the Venus of Willendorf. There's no scale on these for you, so let me kind of give you a sense. Venus of Willendorf is actually about this big, so kind of from my eye to my chin, maybe a little bit smaller. Funny little story about the Venus of Willendorf. When I was pregnant with my daughter, I was not one of those svelte, cute little pregnant women. I actually was ginormous. Worked out fine, whatever. Lots of variation in this, but I looked a lot like this Venus Willendorf figure. So before my husband took off to do field work that year, because we both do field work in Eastern Africa, and before he left, on his field work, I gave him one of these Venus of Willendorf figures so he could remember what I looked like while he was gone. Like this giant Venus figurine. I definitely was a Venus figurine. Anyway, and that's the idea, that we're thinking that these may have been figures that celebrated the reproductive capacity of females, of women. There's this idea, there's this thought that the Gravettians and the Aurignacians may actually have been much more of a matriarchal kind of society, kind of cultures, unlike most of the ones that we see today. Kind of interesting. There's the Venus, another Venus figurine, some variation in the body shapes that they're using. I mentioned also with the Gravettians that they're pretty well known for cave paintings. Let me show you some of the photos of spectacular cave paintings associated with the Gravettian cultures. Here is Altamira, Altamira Cave in Spain, dating to 22,000 years ago, with those animals on the ceiling. Take you to Lascaux Cave in France. Now, we think, and we, not being me, but the archaeologists who study this, they think that what may have been going on were that these were really important caves, that they may have had religious significance. Many of these paintings are not right when you first walk into a cave, but you actually have to descend pretty far into the cave in order to get to these more open caverns inside the cave, and that then the paintings were done on the ceilings and the walls of these giant caverns. So if you think back in time, they had those oil lamps, but they would have had to have gone way back in, and so you would be looking at these paintings not with the static still light of a flashlight, for example, but with the movement of a flame, of a torch, of an oil lamp. And so when people have gone into caves such as Lascaux with those kinds of torches, they actually see that the animals, they seem to dance, they seem to have movement to them. And so perhaps these were areas, regions of religious importance, of spiritual importance. And it was showing the animals that were existing with them. Remember, these are mammoth hunters. They hunted large mammals. Some more pictures for you to give you a sense of some of the animals. We see wild horses here. Here you can see some carnivores that were living on the landscape with them as well. More wild horses. Some interesting figures alongside of them. Looks as though they also would depict hunting. Perhaps these were depicting important stories about hunting these animals. That guy seems not to have done so well. Hard to know. Going back in time. Here you have reindeer with the antlers of the reindeer. Now, one of the things I also want to point out is that it wasn't just, we don't only see cave paintings in Europe. They tend to get the European caves, because they're so well preserved, because of the way that the climate is in Europe. We have more of them, and there's been a lot of people looking for them. So we know about them to a better degree than we do in other places of the world. But cave paintings are not exclusive to Europe. There were people painting inside of caves in other places. For example, in Sulawesi, there are some cave paintings as well that date to about 39,000 years old. In Western Australia, cave paintings dating to 27,000 years old. And we don't have cave paintings yet, but we do have paintings from Namibia at 27,000 years ago. So I've been emphasizing the European part of this story, but just to let you know that this was not, that kind of technology and that kind of artistic expression was not in any way, shape, or form limited only to that region of the world at that time period. So back to thinking about that oscillation of climate. So we are now starting to get into, as we get into the end of the Gravettian cultural period in Europe, we're getting towards the height of the last glacial maximum, when it starts to really become cold with the last ice age. Now with that last ice age, we have the glaciers forming, and lots of the water on Earth was started to become more and more trapped, not just in the Arctic regions, but also in these glaciers. And so much of Europe became covered in ice sheets. And that gets us then to the end of the Gravettians, and moving on to our next little video.